Welcome, welcome all. Welcome back to the Greyhorn Pagans podcast. Thank you for joining us on another, what will surely be amazing episode. Before we really get into the episode, first of all, thank you all so much for finally getting me to 1K subscribers. It has been a journey. It has been a long time coming. It was the like the last dozen or so, just took forever, but finally made it. So, yeah, let's continue on with the amazing guests and the interesting topics. So, with me today, I have Seth Vandebrooke. Your last name really sounding Dutch, by the way,
But
Vanderbroek.
it's not. Yeah,
It's
it throws
not.
people off. Yeah, it's because my name is actually made up in the sense that a long time ago, great whatever grandfather originally it was actually just Brooks. It was an English name, but he was adopted when his parents died. A bunch of kids, they get adopted, and they ended up combining what was a Dutch name with a not Dutch name, and then it became whatever this is, which is Vanderbroek.
Okay.
Because if it would make more sense if it was Vanderbroek, which is what everyone
Yeah,
says, but it's not what it is. It's Vanderbroek. Yeah, it gets everybody
yeah, and then Brooke with with the E at the end
with an
to like
E.
make it extra confusing. So, okay. And today we will be covering something that I didn't even really know was a thing, and I bet many pagans, many heathens with me, namely cryptids and other mythological creatures in the Bible, or just in the Christian faith. Most of us know about the Leviathan, or the behemoth. We know about the great beasts, of course, just like especially the Leviathan. We have a similar being in Norse mythology, of course, Jormungandr, the world snake. In Greek mythology, there will be the Ouroboros. Other than that, I didn't know that the Bible mentions you know others even, and that's why I invited Seth. So thank you very much for coming on. For those who may not be familiar with you or your work just yet, introduce yourself. What do you do? What are you about? What's your secrets?
Yeah, so as you said, my name is Seth Vanderbrook. I have a blog called projecteleazar.com where I address a lot of enigmas in the Bible and in history. And I love looking at old texts. That's kind of the thing that I do. My full-time job is actually working for my church, answering Bible questions. We get questions from all around the world. And so I get to answer those questions about what does the Bible say about this? What does the Bible say about that? What does it mean when it says this? What does your pastor think about that thing or this thing or whatever? So lots of questions, and I get to do that full time, which is amazing. And then in my part time is when I'm doing a lot of research, reading a lot of old dusty books, I like to say. My research has really been a blast. It's led down some crazy rabbit trails, not just with topics, but even with people that I've met. Doing a lot of travel over the last few years and meeting a lot of interesting people, hearing a lot of stories, and visiting a lot of museums and working with the Library of Congress here in the U.S. who have helped me a lot with a lot of the research. So some of the cooler stuff has included working with translators to translate texts that haven't been translated into English yet, to get some answers to a few questions that I've had about cryptids, especially with Dogman specifically. So yeah, I'm excited to come on today and talk about things that I think a lot of pagans and Christians don't even know the Bible is talking about, and how there are some actually very strong similarities between the things that we believe.
Yeah. Wow. Answering questions like about the Bible and such like that'll keep you busy, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned it briefly, and I say, that's perhaps a good starting point. The dog man or dog-headed saint. I have seen it before. I have probably read about him before in or seen like some conspiracy channel talk about it. They eat that stuff up, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I mean, other than that, I know it exists, and supposedly it's a saint with, well, literally a dog's head, otherwise really a human body. I don't know much about it. So, um, you know, help me out here.
Yeah, well,
Who is the dog-headed saint? What does he have a dog's head? Like, is it a dog? Is it what is it?
yeah. So it comes from a long-standing tradition. It's actually a very old Coptic story, but this is one of those stories where there are a million versions of it, and it's almost impossible to know where exactly it comes from. There are a lot of writings about this, and a lot of scholars have done all these comparisons between all these texts and all these writings and all. It's an old story, but it goes. The oldest one that I know of is essentially describing this Saint Christopher specifically, because this concept is a lot older. But for this specific saint, Christopher, he's the more famous one that people know about. And the story goes essentially that there's this dog-headed man, Christopher, and he was a Canaanite, which means that he was in that Mesopotamian region, right? And he was searching for basically the strongest god. And so he's serving this one, and then he's serving that one, and then he finds his way to the devil, and he's like, like this guy's at the top, he's the most powerful. And then someone came along, and I forget actually exactly what happens, but there's this encounter. Someone uses the name of Jesus, and he's like, the name of Jesus was stronger than even this guy. Well, then he must be the strongest. And so then he goes to follow Jesus. And then when he does, he gets converted. Again, a lot of different variations to all these little details, but then he like gets baptized by rain, or he gets baptized by the Jordan River. It depends. He ends up helping and carrying this child who wants to get across the river. So because he's also very big, he was like a giant, he carries this child across the river. And then this weird thing happens where he's like, oh, the baby's like, I'm Jesus. It's a weird story. And I don't think that it's true, but this is the story, right? And so the idea is that, one way or another, whatever the version is, he ends up getting converted to Catholicism. And he ends up becoming this saint when he starts preaching the word to Gentiles and even to other dog-headed people. Some versions say that then he's blessed with the ability to speak, because otherwise he wasn't able to communicate with humanity, but that then he was able to speak human languages. So yeah, that bunch of variations, bunch of different versions of that, but that's kind of the older paraphrase of that story.
Wow. Okay. So, geez, let's unpack that. Like, it's like, oh, by the way, he was also a giant.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah.
The
Yeah. Why
child that
not?
yeah, sure, why not? Dog-headed and a giant, and later on a
Yeah.
saint. Sure, anything's possible. Why not?
Yeah.
Then the child that he helped across the river, or carried across the river, was like, oh, by the way, I'm Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
That came out of nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
There's so many. Go ahead. Yeah.
other dog-headed people, like he preached to other dog-headed
Mm-hmm.
people. So there was a whole bunch of them, like a whole, like, was it a separate species? Is it like a separate? I don't know.
Yes.
It kind of sounds kind of like an abomination or something, or what God would say is an abomination. But then he says that, oh, you're a saint now. It's a lot. It's
That's
confusing.
Yeah, there's a lot. The reason why it's a lot, right, is because this is something that's taken out of kind of the center of a very, not just one, but many different histories, right? So on the Christian side, so if for those who understand the Bible well, the fact that he was a giant and that he was a Canaanite would have made a lot of sense, because it's the Canaanite tribes in the Bible that were described as being giants, right? So that would actually track. The idea of him being dog-headed is actually not, or at least for a long time, wasn't a normal Christian idea. That would have been a little bit more like, whoa, this is crazy. And I think they use that for some pretty intense symbolism, that look at how like God can redeem even the monstrous, right? That all are welcome into the kingdom of heaven, not just someone who's, good looking or looks like a normal human. But the idea was that it was going into the far reaches, which is very interesting, because if this, creature was real and it was a giant with a dog head, then it likely would have been a descendant of the Nephilim, of which they were not, at least in the Old Testament, liked very much by God, because they were an abomination. And so he was having them like hunted down and destroyed, in many cases just doing it himself. But, coming into the New Testament, where now Christ has grace and all this stuff, it actually became a very popular topic in the early church, and just up until the 16th, 17th century. that Christians were debating, hey, do we witness to these people? Do we welcome them into the church? Should they get saved? And that assumes that they exist, right? And so we have all these writings where people are saying in personal letters, like that they're even, for an example of a personal letter would be the Epistola de Cynocephalus, which was a letter about the dog-headed people by Ratrimnus of Corbie, who then wrote a letter to his friend Rimbert, who was actually a missionary in Scandinavia. And Rimbert was saying, hey, I'm encountering these dog-headed people. Should I be witnessing to them or not? Should I be welcoming them to the king? Can they be saved at all? Like, do they have souls that can be saved? Because for hundreds of years, the Catholic Church had a tradition that said, hey, these guys exist, but they're not fully human. So that means that they can't be saved. So that was this religious debate back and forth of, are they human? Do they have souls? Can they be saved? For a long time. In fact, St. Augustine, which is a pretty famous leader in the Catholic Church, he, in his book, A City of God, book 16, chapter 8, he has a whole chapter dedicated to multiple monstrous races, including the dog-headed people, but not limited to. That was just one of them. He was including giants. He was talking about the people with their faces and their chests. He was talking about dwarves. He's talking about all these different creatures. Just lists a few of them out. Not all of them, but some of them. And he's like, hey, a lot of talk about this in the church, whether or not these people can be saved and whether or not these people there are full races of them. And he essentially says, look, I don't know what's going on. I've never seen any of them, but if there are, we know some of them exist in minority, like a birth here, a birth there of these monstrous people. He's like, why can't there be full races? So he kind of leaves it open-ended and like he's not dogmatic about it, but he says, hey, something could be dogmatic about it. But he just acknowledges that it's a possibility. But there are many others throughout church history who are saying not only that they might exist, but Ratrimnus at the end of his letter to Rimbert, he's like fully conclusive. He's like, look, everybody before me, and we're talking about somebody who was very conservative, who argued everything that Augustine argued, right? He was known for being like very gung-ho about everything that Augustine said. He ended up contradicting everybody before him in the Catholic Church and said, no, these are definitely human. They definitely have souls and they can definitely be saved, which was this radical thing for him to say at the time, especially to his friend in the Carolingian period, because this was 9th century AD. So pretty wild. But there's a long history of this going all the way back to, 4th century, 3rd century BC, where we have people like Herodotus and Ctesias who said that there were some in Libya, but there's a lot in India. And Ctesias specifically saying there were hundreds of thousands of them, that there are full kingdoms and that kings traded with them in India and they had weapons and they were like these mighty warriors. Some traditions say that they were giant as well. The palace in Nineveh that was discovered, it's still in Britain right now, but there's this plaque that shows these dog-headed people actually being hired on as assassins for the king of Nineveh. So there's this wealth of history that discusses, like, I'm drowning in documents that talk about this race of these dog-headed creatures, that if you go far back enough, we have literally Akkadian cuneiform texts. They're Hittite texts that go back to like 1700 BC, which again are Canaanite and will align with the biblical tradition that these creatures would have been descended from the Nephilim, which is a good segue. But I know I just dumped a whole bunch of information. So
yeah, man. Wow. Okay. So Canaanite, it kind of makes sense, Canine. It's
sure.
If there is a connection, it just sounds like it have the same root word perhaps. India, Libya, like my mind, especially India goes to like all the Hindu gods that are like you have the Hindu gods. I don't know their names. I'm very bad with my Eastern gods. I have people for that. No, but if you have the monkey god, the god who looks like an elephant. Like you have so many more of those. My wife is crazy about the Egyptian pantheon. Like the dog-headed. It's Anubis.
Yeah, Anubis.
Of course, you have.
There are 2 others too.
Even 2 others. Okay.
Yeah.
That's my wife's thing. I don't know much about that. I'm mainly Europe focused. Like you have, cats, had alligators, like fucking just no crocodiles. There will be crocodiles. pardon me. So you have them as, well, as gods or divine beings in other parts of the world, but there were entire kingdoms, like there were entire kingdoms of them. And you also mentioned like I've seen those before, heard about those before, like yeah, what is it? People who have their face like on their torso, or who
Yeah,
have just
the
this
Blemmies.
one giant leg that
Yep,
they hop
the
around.
Sciapods. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you actually, of course, you know the names. So, but they're all mentioned and written down as legit, as they
Mm-hmm.
actually exist, and we have seen them, and we have, firsthand accounts of them. Because that's one thing that has bothered me for so long, and it still kind of bothers me. It's like, oh, those ancients with their rich imagination, just
Yeah.
making up things, and it's like, no, it's
No.
it's like there are stories of people who have met them. There are stories who have, like you said, the other Indian kings, like they have an active trade with them, hired them on
Mm-hmm.
as mercenaries. Why would you make something like that up?
Mm-hmm.
But like, so there's a full list of these beings told to actually exist, even though Augustine said, hey, like, I don't know for sure, but like everyone around
Mm-hmm.
me says that, either they've seen them or they've heard from people that have seen them. Um, so how?
Yeah, I know. It is a lot. So yeah, so let's take a step back, right?
Mhm.
So we have all these different monstrous races, right? That throughout history a lot of people are describing, and there are various lists, right? And there are certain, of course, there's always a pattern where maybe there's 5 to 10 different races that pretty much everybody is mentioning, and then of course there are all the variations. So you might have the core ones, and then there are like other kind of stragglers on the end, where depending on where you are, they are or not included, right? And that tradition, that idea of these monstrous races has really just always been there. Like the oldest writings that we have mention these races, right? Whether Greek or Chinese or anywhere, everybody seems to have a tradition about this. And that's one of the things that is pretty convincing about it, is that everyone knew for thousands of years in different cultures and different languages across time, like, okay, if it's a prank, that's an insanely impressive one, right? Like, there's no way that everybody makes that up and keeps that prank going for thousands of years across the world without communication, right? So something's there. It's pretty hard for you to say that nothing's there. Of course, I say it's hard, and yet most of the modern world still says it. It's made up, like you said, and
Yeah, that can be, and that it's exactly what you said. Like so many different, people, so many different races, so many different empires, kingdoms, chiefdoms over the thousands of years have their stories about them. I'd be very hard pressed to think that it's all just imagination,
it's all
or
metaphor.
God. Oh, that is. I think that's would be even worse. Oh no, it's all a metaphor for something else, as you mentioned with the dog-headed saint.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's a metaphor for something else, or, it's written about in metaphors. I'm sure you can, attach a metaphor onto it, or kind of, a lesson that,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like we mentioned before we went live, kind of with the gargoyles, the beauty is within, the beauty of God, or, whatever is within. So even if he, like we'll still say that about people that, he's got a freaking, dog face. It's like he's that ugly that, uh, which is kind of rude.
Yeah.
I doubt that, that was it, or that was, all of it. Especially if they say that there's like, that he also preached to just, well, all the others. It's like, okay, so
There are more.
there
Mm-hmm.
was an entire race of dog-headed giants, which still sounds weird.
Yeah, and not all of them were giants. So like some of them are mentioned as being giants, and then a lot of them were mentioned as not. They were still frequently referred to as being tall, but not necessarily giant. There's a lot of variation, just like there is with other giants, right? So you have the Cyclops, that almost everybody has a version of Cyclops, right? I mean, their list of monstrous races. And so, but then there were just normal giants where it's like you look like a dude, but pretty big, you know? And so there were different giants of these different races was part of the idea. So varying
Oh.
giants, varying races. Yeah. And this is part of this, again, like backing up, the biblical paradigm wraps a lot of these things up in this concept of the Nephilim, later then becoming the word Rephaim. I said that wrong. It's not that it becomes it, but they start using the word Rephaim to refer to it instead of Nephilim, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
okay.
it becomes the slang. It's like the catch-all term. Rephaim takes over in popularity, but Nephilim is the word that goes back further. And the idea was really this, that the story goes in Genesis 6 that God, who had created all these angelic creatures, right, of which there is a lot of diversity. So most people think of like the Catholic version where you have like a woman or a baby and they have wings, right? Or a dude maybe with wings. And the Bible never describes angels that way, not even once. Some people are like, well, what about that one passage with that one weird, like, it's like there are women with wings. Like, yes, but that's all iconography, and they're never called angels, and they clearly represent people groups. So we won't get into that. But the idea is this, right? You have these angels that don't look, a lot of which don't look human. We have the ones that are described as looking entirely human, and then there are ones that look very not human. A very not meaning when we read passages about the cherubim or the seraphim, the cherubim being these, really, it's actually the biblical version of a sphinx. So
Oh.
they look a little different, but they're basically a sphinx. And the idea was this, that they would have heads of different animals, right? Or heads
Mhm.
of a human. Both goes back and forth, changes here and there. So there's variety. They'd have wings, and then they'd have these powerful bodies. Not always, lions, sometimes more oxen or whatever, or they had the feet of an ox. And they'd be this chimeric combination, right? But the idea was that they fulfilled the same role as the Sphinx, as in that they were always the guardians of thrones or the guardians of certain trees, actually, like the Garden of Eden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of life for eternal life,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So in that narrative in Genesis 3, God says, so Adam and Eve, right, they fall into the temptation from the serpent who says, hey, which by the way, when the serpent tempts them, when he's speaking to Eve and he says, if you take this fruit, you'll be like God. That word there is Elohim, and it can mean God, meaning Yahweh, like the creator God, or
Mhm.
it can also mean just the gods in general. If this is a nerdy thing, I'm going to say a nerdy word, and then I'll explain it. But it's a concretized abstract plural. And what that means is this word is something like the word sheep, right? It's a concept that can be plural or it can be singular. It also means that it's this abstract concept that can mean these spiritual beings in general, but it's been concretized about a specific subject. It's about Yahweh. So in this case, it can be either thing. So if we interpret that word to mean Elohim plural, meaning the gods, what the devil would have been saying is, if you eat this fruit, you'll be like us, like the rest of us, right? You'll be like these Elohim that God created. Elohim meaning just the spiritual beings in the spiritual realm that God had created. Because in Eden at the time, God was there and the angelic hosts were there. They were all there. Humanity was there, which is why when he walks up looking like a serpent, which a seraphim is a serpentine-looking angel. So that seraph, meaning serpent or burning one, it would have been like this fiery, flying serpent angel person, is how
Sounds
these
like a
seraphim
sounds like a dragon
sounds like a
in
dragon,
a
doesn't it?
way.
Yeah, and
As you
so,
like with the
hmm
the cherubim that you mentioned, like my mind also kind of went to the centaur, for
yeah.
example. They are also known as guardians or guardians of the forest.
And here's what's interesting, right? So when we look at these concepts and the things that they're tempted in and right and everything, all that happens, these different characters that I'm mentioning along the way, the cherubim and seraphim, here are these angelic creatures that sound a lot like what the gods look like in pagan mythologies, right? They're combinations of man and animal, right? And then we have these other creatures like the Nephilim and centaurs in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible in Isaiah 34 verse 14, it actually says the word centaur. But that time, it's not talking about the angelic host. It's actually referring to these creatures that are negative. They're these abominations. Like God is saying himself, hey, these abominations are going to haunt Babylon after I destroy you, right? And so there are these two groups. There are these cryptid creatures that exist that are from something else, which I'm about to explain. And then there are these cryptid sounding creatures that are really just simply members of the angelic realm of all these hosts that God created in the beginning, the heavenly hosts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the devil would be one of them, right? Michael the archangel would be one of them. But there's tons of variety. There are all these different creatures. They look different. They look magnificent. A lot of them are described as like glowing and their eyes of fire, or like they're crazy looking, right? But these guys very much match up with a lot of, not all, but a lot of different gods that you'll find in different traditions. And then again, we have this other group, which when we fast forward from Genesis 3 over to Genesis 6, when it then says in verses 1 through 4, it describes these, it says the sons of God. Now, what are the sons of God? They're these Elohim. They're these spiritual creatures that look like everything I just described, right? All sorts of different forms. And they're looking down, and it says that they see human women and they go, those are pretty attractive women. They go, I think I like that. And I think I also want to have progeny. I want to have a legacy. I want to have children. And so they come down, they pick wives. It says whoever they chose, they had. And then those women gave birth, and they gave birth to the Nephilim, which the Bible then says are the men of old, the men of renown, which specifically is saying, hey, these are the heroes of old, right? The Hercules, the whoever, right? These are the heroes of old that were strong and mighty and had all these powers. These were the demigods, right? So when we connect this with the Greco-Roman or even Egyptian mythologies, these combinations, when we start to see these people rise up out of nowhere, they're born of the gods and yet they're also men. Who are they? Well, the biblical explanation is, hey, these guys are the Nephilim. Now, the twist that the Bible gives is hey, these guys aren't the good guys. The Bible's claiming these guys aren't positive heroes. These are actually men who are evil. They look great in the sight of men. They look like they're all that, right? But in reality, they're wicked. And it's funny because when you look at the stories, even the pagan versions of them, these guys are not the best. I mean, they can do some pretty messed up stuff to people, right? There's raping, there's slaughtering of these people that's unnecessary. There's all this crazy stuff going on, right? And so God is looking at that and saying, hey, that's not okay, right? Like these things are not acceptable in the eyes of God. So that's the twist that the Bible gives. It says, hey, yeah, no, those guys are real. They're on the wrong side of the battle. So you carry on reading through the Bible. The next time, the only other time the word Nephilim shows up is in Numbers 13, verse 33. And in that verse, what it does something very important. It connects the concept of the Nephilim with these other tribes, the Anakim, and then several others, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and all these different guys, right? And he says, hey, these guys are descendants of the Nephilim. Now, part of what's interesting is that for those who are like paying attention, they'd be like, well, hold on. In Genesis 6, you have all of these giants and stuff, which are only briefly mentioned, right? Doesn't build on that. It isn't until later passages that we get more explanation. But then right after that, all this wickedness comes into the world. And that was the point, right? So God's like, hey, these guys are just breeding wickedness. The extra biblical text would expound and say that really these giants become bloodthirsty. They're killing everybody. They're eating everything. And the world is literally just plummeting. This is all pre-flood. But then God says, I'm going to bring about this flood. He has a reset, destroys everything, saves the one righteous man and his family, and then there's peace again. But then, several generations afterward, you get the story of the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And after that, then here's this thing that this trips a lot of Christians up too. At this time, when the Tower of Babel happens, there are other passages later on that look back and add stuff that the writer of Genesis assumes you already know, because in their time, right, they already have the context, they already know what happened, right? But later on, there are verses that look back and say, oh yeah, by the way, for anyone who
Yeah.
didn't know. And in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, this is where we see a passage that says that at the time when God divided the nations, so that's the Tower of Babel, he spreads them out, he divides the nations, he establishes these borders, that when he did that, it says he divided the world according to the number of the sons of God. What does that mean? It means that when he did this, he split them up, and then he put these spiritual beings, these sons of God, right? All these guys we just talked about,
Yeah.
eyes of fire, right? And he puts them over these nations. So he places them there, and these become
Okay.
the gods of the nations. These become what later on the New Testament looks back and says, Paul looks at these guys and says, so those guys were created, they were real, God put them there, and then they rebelled. They actually rebelled against Yahweh and said, we're going to do things our way. And this is where you get this fascinating psalm. I want to read this to you because it's 8 verses. It's very short, but
Sure.
it's really interesting. Again, this is something a lot of Christians don't even recognize and might rock some of their worlds a little bit. But in Psalm 82, verses 1 through 8, it says this: God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And then it says, quote, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? And then he says, give justice to the weak and to the fatherless, maintain the right and the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And then he says, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. And then he says this: I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High himself. All of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like men and fall like any prince. And then the writer of this psalm pops in and he has this little aside note he puts in. He says, rise, O God, and judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. And when he said that, you will inherit all the nations, he's actually looking forward to a prophecy that wouldn't come true until Jesus. Because the idea was this, that when God divided the nations, he said, fine, you guys are rebelling. You don't want to be under me. You're building this Tower of Babel. All right, I will, unfortunately, allow you to make that decision, and I will disinherit you. I'll leave you alone. I'll have nothing to do with you. I'll make my own nation, and that's what Deuteronomy 32, verse 9 says. I'm going to make Israel. And that's where he grabs Abraham out of Ur, out of Mesopotamia, a guy who his wife couldn't have children, and says, I'm going to have you have children, and we're going to make this nation that is going to reveal to everybody else that I am Yahweh, and they should be following me because I created these gods. They're rebelling against me. So once he does that, what this is saying is his plan all along was that he would re-inherit those nations, that he would welcome the pagans back and say, hey, all you nations that I let you go, you're welcome to come back. It's not just the Jews. It's anyone who wants to. And this is what the Apostle Paul kept saying. He's like, this is the mystery of the gospel of Christ, that it's not only the Jews who are welcome into God's kingdom, it's that through Jesus Christ, he's paid the price for anyone who choose to make him Lord of their lives, that they would be welcomed into the kingdom of heaven. But in that's what baptism was. It was this defecting. It was defecting into the kingdom of God. Well, that's why you end up with all this spiritual warfare, right? And all these demons fighting against and saying no, because like, no, those are our people. And God's like, if they choose me, there's nothing you can do to stop them because I created them and I created you. And that's why Paul actually goes straight to the Greeks, and he preaches to them in Acts 17. And he literally, this is cool because this ties in with what Plato says in Timaeus and Critias. He said to them, he was like, men of Athens, I'm quoting here. He says, I perceive that in every way you are very religious and everything. He made from one man every nation, Adam, of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined the allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place. And he goes on, but what he does, and here's these two things that he mentions. He mentions to the unknown God, and he mentions the allotted boundaries of dwelling place, right? So that goes back to Tower of Babel when he allotted everything, right? And he says to the unknown God. A lot of people don't recognize this, it was actually a very popular understanding in the ancient Greek world that there was this unknown God, that the unknown God was actually the singular creator of all, including the gods. And this was something that, if you read Timaeus and Critias by Plato, he lines up very clearly. And Timaeus was explaining in this writing to Socrates why it was so obvious that this was the case. And he makes this philosophical argument. He says, everything, he said there are two types of things in existence. There's that which is infinite, there's that which is finite, right? If it's infinite, there's no beginning, there's no end. That also means that it can't change because there's nothing in between either. They can't change because there's no beginning, there's no end, there's no middle. It just is, therefore it just exists. And then he says there's that which is finite, which is the opposite of that. It's always changing. It can never fully be one thing because it's in this state of finiteness, that there is a beginning, there is an end, and it's always going to be changing, right? And so he looks around and he says, look at the universe. There's constant change, right? There's constant change in the stars and the heavens and the earth, and everything is changing. It's like, that means that there's a beginning. The universe has to come from somewhere. It is finite. So if it's finite, then where did this finite thing come from? He's like, everything has a cause. So someone had to create this universe. So then he says, all right, in order for something to pre-exist things that exist, it has to be infinite. Because otherwise, then what made that, right? Like, you have to come to the original source. So he's like, clearly there's something that would be outside of all of this that would be infinite. That means that he would have no beginning and have no end. And then he looks at creation, he breaks down, and he does this like step by step by step, like logical argument where he says, well, what do we see? How can we understand this unknowable creator of everything, right? And he's like, well, we see beauty. And so he looks around and he says, there's obviously beauty. And he says, for any artist that makes anything, they're always basing it off of beauty they see elsewhere, right? And he said, if nothing else existed before this God, then that God must be beautiful. And if he's infinite, that means he's infinitely beautiful, right? And then he continues to look at everything that he created. And he's like, all right, so if this God created everything and it's beautiful and there's clearly intelligence and there's wisdom and all these things, then he must be infinitely those characteristics. And that includes, instead of keeping all of that beauty and wisdom and intelligence to himself, but instead sharing that, then he's not jealous. And if he's not jealous and greedy, then he must be loving to give those things out. So here we have this all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, all-beautiful, all-wise and intelligent creator that is infinite in all of those ways. And he refers to him as the maker and the father of all, which blows my mind as a Christian, because I'm like, oh, those are the words we use, right? So I'm like, why is this, Greek pagan using the same words that I use to refer to the creator of everything? And then he goes on to describe, he made the other gods, and then the other gods do all this stuff. And then in his description, he actually says, he describes the allotment, that these gods are allotted over the regions of the earth. And it's in total agreement with the Bible in Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. It's an agreement with what Paul was saying here. And so Paul was describing to these Greeks, hey, so you know how you guys already have this concept. You already know logically and philosophically, I just made that word up, and through philosophy, that there has to be a God that made all the gods. There has to be a source of all these things. He's like, and you refer to him as this unknown God because he's unknowable, because they describe how it's like, how can you even comprehend something like that? It's beyond everything. He's beyond visible. He's this invisible God, which the Bible also refers to him as that. And so Paul says, hey guys, I can tell you who this unknown God is. And that fascinated the Greeks because they were like, how? That's right. That's impossible. So they're like locked in. They're like, what's going on? Like, explain this to me, And so he explains, the story and scripture and how Jesus came and how all this, points back to Yahweh being the God who created. And then, and then you have this split. So, half the pagans are like, that makes a lot of sense. And then they start following Jesus and Yahweh. And then the other half are like, I'm not convinced. And they continue on in their ways. But that's how the Bible actually is in a lot of agreement with at least aspects, right? There's contradictions, but like aspects of the pagan understanding. The difference is in whether or not you believe Christ to be fully God and fully man, right? That he died for sins and all that. And then the difference is whether or not you believe that Yahweh is that the God of the Jews, the God of Jesus, is the supreme God who created everything else. Those differences aside, you have very similar stories. In fact, even Peter, in his letter to one of the churches, in 2 Peter chapter 2, 4 through 6, when he describes the Genesis 6 story, he talks about those angels coming down and giving birth to these demigods and everything, which he says, hey, those angelic creatures that did that, those are actually the ones who were thrown into Tartarus. He uses the word Tartarus, but he connects it to the Greek mythology. He says, those are the Titans, and now they're chained in gloomy darkness in the abyss. But he's saying Yahweh's the one who put him there, not Zeus, not the others, right? So there are these similarities, and then those are some of the differences. I know I
It's
said a
funny,
lot, so
yeah,
yeah.
no, but it's all very interesting, and it's something that I have definitely, definitely learned, have seen over the years, that like, take whatever religion, whatever spiritual path someone may follow, and there are so many things that connect. And what you described as the Elohim, like the created
Mm-hmm.
gods who become the different gods of the different lands, to me that kind of sounds like the very, let's say, the very first pagan gods, those
Mm-hmm.
primordial beings from
Right.
whom eventually the gods that we know as the pagan gods
Mm-hmm.
eventually came, which also kind of would mean, I guess, um that the pagan gods that we know, that would they be the Nephilim then?
So yes and no. So I'm so glad you brought that up because that was the next thing I was gonna hit on. So you have those two categories I described, right? And essentially both categories become gods. So you have the fallen angels,
Mm-hmm.
right? Some of which would stick around, some are thrown in Tartarus, right? All sorts of stuff going on. And then the ones that become, because remember, the ones that are thrown into Tartarus, that was before the flood. So
Yeah.
now, after the flood, after Tower of Babel, then these other, angelic beings, these gods are put over the nations. Those ones stick around. Now, God pronounces that judgment in Psalm 82 and says, "You will die like princes, but not yet." Right? So they're on a probation, if you will. So they're still sticking around, but and they still have power and all that stuff. But God is continually telling the Jews, "Hey, stop worshiping them. They're not your God." And he says that a lot. Like, he's not denying that they exist. He says, "Don't worship them. They're not yours. Like, I'm your God. You worship me. Don't want
Yeah.
worship their gods. That's the God of the Moabites. So that's the God of whoever." And he names them. He names, Ashtaroth, and he names Kamash and all these different gods. Says, yeah, those gods, yeah, those are the gods over those nations. But you worship me, right? And he's continually, telling them, I pulled you out of nothing. Like, you guys are gonna worship me, all right? And so what you have is you have those gods, but then you also have in Deuteronomy 32, I believe it's verse 17. It talks about new gods which their fathers had not known. And you're like, where did they come from, right? What are these new ones? And the word that they use there is that they call it a few different things, like sons of God, gods, Elohim, Elim, and then it also uses this word shadim, which is, it's like the word shade, but in plural form. And that shade is actually this concept for demon. And the idea was this, that when the Nephilim, they were alive, right? They fight, they die. When they died, some of them, not all, stuck around. Essentially a ghost in a way. And as they stuck around, they actually became these, lesser gods that continue on. So this is what would make a lot of sense with, now it could be either way, but this is what could make a lot of sense with some of these gods that are these chimeric combinations like Anubis, right? Or who knows, maybe Anubis was actually one of those Elohim and his sons were the ones that were the dog-headed people. I don't know. However that works, the idea is that some of these Nephilim that now die, specifically that word Rephaim that I mentioned, that word, as you continue to read, now it's harder for English speakers because it's then translated, but you can use software and stuff to see the original words. But when you follow that word, you trace that word throughout Scripture, that word Rephaim starts as just referring to a specific tribe of giants, right? And then it becomes this catch-all term for them in general. And then it's this category, like, and then it says in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, oh, well, these guys were counted as Rephaim. And then over time, all of a sudden, that word starts being used to refer to these departed spirits that stick around. These evil spirits that are doing these different things and that look very different, that have these different characteristics and attributes. So those new gods that come up, or those different spirits that are now added to the pantheon, if you will, are actually these Nephilim, which is interesting because we have narratives of people who are demigods and they rise to become a god, right? And so the biblical idea was that really that rising to become a god was simply them dying and then continuing to be venerated as a god, continuing to have spiritual power and domain here. But those are the very creatures that are referred to as demons in the New Testament. That
interesting.
Jesus is casting out of people. Like, why is it that when they're possessed, they're strung like a giant? Why is that? Why do they why are they breaking chains and doing all this stuff with all this strength that they shouldn't have, right? All these powers that are related to these Nephilim that in fact, when, they see Jesus and they're like, please don't cast us where? They said into the abyss, which is that Tartarus location. They're like, don't do what you did to our parents. I don't want to go where they went, not yet. And they said, don't do it before our time. So they know, they're like, we know it's coming, but not yet. Like, you're not supposed to do that yet. And this is where Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 10, he says this flat out. This will be interesting for you guys to hear, I'm sure. I'll just read these quick verses. Verses 5 through 6 of chapter 8 in 1 Corinthians, Paul said this. He said, for although there are many so-called gods in heaven and on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things are and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things are all things and through whom we exist. So he says kind of twice there, one with God and one with Jesus, putting them in the same boat, right? But there's that concept again where he's saying, look, I'm not saying those gods don't exist. I'm saying that they came from Yahweh and I worship Yahweh. And then in chapter 10, verses 19 through 21, he says, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything? Because he's addressing how like Christians were getting pretty finicky about, like, some of them were like, we can't eat food that's been sacrificed to idols. And the other ones were like, no, it's fine. It's not a problem. And so he was addressing this. And he was like, look, guys, you can eat the food. It's okay. Unless if like your brother is really like struggling with it and you just, okay, then don't do it in front of him. But you're like, it's okay for you to do it, right? And so he says, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. And so you think, oh, so then he's saying that idols aren't legitimate. And he says, but if you keep reading, he says, no, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Now, here's the interesting thing about that word demons, right? The Greek word demon, it's actually neutral. It's not good or bad. Now, Paul,
daemon.
right? Paul is using this in a negative context, but it's meaning this. He's looking at those as, hey, so those gods. He literally said, for indeed they are there, right? Like, they exist. There's some in heaven. There's some on earth, right? And then he's like, but if you're going to be a Christian, he's saying you can't partake of because if you do communion, the whole idea is communion is just like with pagan sacrifice, when you sacrifice something to a god and then you were to eat of that food or drink of that wine or whatever. The idea is that you're partaking in, this relationship with that entity you're worshiping. It's the same thing with communion. Christ says, hey, when you partake in communion, this is my blood, this is my flesh. And that's what he's saying. Like, and this is exactly what he goes on to explain in this chapter in 1 Corinthians 10. Paul's like, if you partake of communion, you're partaking in the sacrifice of Christ, and you are partaking in that altar when he was sacrificed on the cross. So he's describing Christ's death as an offering, right? It's just like with the pagan sacrifices, only it's to God, right? And it's to Yahweh, to the Creator God, right? And so he's saying, hey, you can't do both. Like, he's saying this, like, you're on contradicting sides. And that's the issue here, is like, so no, like, you can eat the meat. And he's like, that's whatever. But what you can't do is partake in that sacrifice like intentionally partake in the sacrifice to these demonic entities, right? To these gods, these lesser gods. You can't do that and be like, oh no, me and Jesus are good friends. He's like, that doesn't work. Like, pick the god, right?
Yeah. No, that seems that sounds pretty logical. You know,
Yeah,
it's you know, it's one or the other. Like you're not even though I know some pagans are, you know, they do follow Christ and the pagan gods, and I mean, I don't agree with that. You know,
yeah, me either.
it's one or the other. I mean, myself, I do see. I've said that many times before, but I do see the value in the teachings of Christ. I do see
Sure.
him as this powerful, you know, mystical, divine figure for sure.
Hmm.
I acknowledge that. It's just I choose to, you know, let that be that. I acknowledge it. I don't necessarily follow him. I don't have anything against him or, you know, against God or the Christians or whatever. It's like, you know, you do you, let me do me, you know, all good.
Right.
That's why, you know, you know, when you emailed me like, hey, you know, like I am a Christian, is it okay if I,
Yeah.
you know, like I have all these scriptures, like, is it okay? No, it's a pagan podcast. It's like, no, you know, it's cool, you know. I let you do you. Like if you let me do me, that's
Hmm.
perfectly fine. Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So that
Yeah.
really also it kind of, I do love actually that it is confirmation of the acknowledgement of other gods, because so many
Hmm.
Christians are like, no, 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 no. There's just one God. All the other gods, either they don't exist or they are, as you mentioned, like they are demons and they're trying to trick you. They may be daemons and, like, you know, guardian spirits. They're not demons as like evil entities as you know, you say they are. There is a major difference in that.
Yes.
But that really sounds like, it sounds like the primordial gods. It sounds like the pagan gods of Europe, and then also like kind of going down even another layer in what we, for example, would now recognize as cryptids. You know, like Mothman,
Hmm.
Owlman,
Hmm.
or the Yeti, or whatever. You know, they are these mysterious mythical beings that like appear and disappear
Hmm.
into thin air, like they have some sort of otherworldly, outer worldly power, which
Right.
would make sense if, you know, they are um this is very much speculation, of course, but if they are like going way down the line, there would be some divine power left.
Right.
Of course, you know, it would take, I think, probably thousands of generations, hundreds of generations, I don't know how many, but to, you know, like fully dilute that.
Right.
Um, so that's interesting. Like that just sounds like the multiple generations of, you know, the primordial gods, the Titans, the, you know, the gods of Europe, the pagan gods,
Hmm.
you know, their children. Like one of my favorite stories that of, you know, of Loki, for example, you know,
Which one?
with the giant stone mason who was tasked with building the wall around Asgard. And as I always say when I, you know, tell this story, yes, even the gods thought it was a good idea to build a wall around their realm.
Ah, yeah.
So yeah, you know,
Yeah.
might not be
Yahweh
such a,
in heaven has walls in heaven.
hey,
Not far off.
there we go.
Looky there.
If
Yep.
even the gods think it's a good idea, there may be something to it.
Yeah.
But, you know, that stonemason turned out to be, you know, of course, a giant who was tricking the gods. You know, he said like, okay, I can finish this wall. It's gonna take me, I don't know, you know, let's say 5 seasons. It's a big wall. Asgard is a, you know, it's a big realm, and there's a lot there, a lot to be covered, a lot to be encircled.
Hmm.
But in trade of that, as like a reward, I want Freya's hand in marriage.
Right.
Because, of course, the most beautiful of all the goddesses, most powerful of all the goddesses, of course, you want her hand in marriage.
Hmm.
That's what everyone wants. And I want the sun and I want the moon. And the gods were like, okay,
It's a tall order.
that's quite the demand. You know, like, I don't know. And then Loki being the trickster.
Being Loki.
I still don't understand why the gods keep listening to him, but he said, "No, you know what?
Not very
Let's
smart.
let's kind of, let's talk. Let's just say, like, give in to his demands, but tell him do it in 3 seasons. There's no way that he's gonna be able to do it in 3 seasons. I mean, look at how big the wall is gonna be, and like we'll send him to like the furthest quarry that we have to make sure that hauling the stones and all that just takes forever." And the gods, they just said like, I mean, should we listen to Loki? I mean, he's got 3 seasons, furthest quarry. Yeah, there should be no way, right? That's what you think.
Yeah.
Turns out that the stonemason, who turned out to be a giant, they didn't know that back then. He had this powerful stallion. He was kind of negotiating that, like, 3 seasons, sure, I can do that, but then I am gonna need my stallion to help me. And the gods were like, sure. There's no way he's gonna do it in 3 seasons here with the stallions, whatever. And then, it's like halfway through the second season, they were like, he's making pretty good time. Actually, it's looking like he's gonna make 3 seasons. What do we do now? Loki! Go fix this. You caused it. Go fix this. So Loki was like, but no, why me? Why always me? What have I done? You convinced us. You said there's no way he's going to be able to do it in 3 seasons. It's looking like he's going to be able to do it in 3 seasons. So either fix the problem or it's your head. And Loki was like, well, I do like my head. Fine. I'll go fix it, I guess. So this is where I'm like kind of the whole cryptid thing comes in a bit as well. He turned himself into this beautiful mare and lured the stallion away to do some hanky-panky in the woods, as you do. And by doing that, he caused enough of a delay that the 3 seasons passed and time was up. But from that coming together of Loki in mare form and the stallion of the giant stonemason, came the 8-legged horse who later was named Sleipnir. And Sleipnir, because Odin and Loki are blood brothers. They're not, they're not like family, but they're blood brothers. So Odin was like, man, like a child came of this. I can't just banish it. Like, I can't banish it to the furthest regions. It is a child of Loki. He did help us. He did fix the problem that we told him to fix, which he caused in the first place. Okay? I'm gonna take this, this horse, under my wing, and then it became, Odin, it became Odin's stallion. It became the horse which enabled him to ride over the 9 realms of the Yggdrasil. It is on Sleipnir that Odin sits during the wild hunt. So like that is another generation down the line, really.
Right.
It's
that's where a lot of these
kind of a divine being, but kind of not.
And this is where the extra biblical passages, Jewish literature that isn't in the Bible, actually speaks to some of that concept. There's a book called the Book of Giants. Already fun, right? The Book of Giants, we only have fragments of it, actually. We don't have the whole thing because we found these scrolls in Qumran and they're very old and there's only fractions of it that still survived, right? But from that, there's actually this fragment. It's Q531 for anyone who wants to look it up. But then that fragment, it talks about how that Genesis 6 narrative, right, that story about the Nephilim being born, it says not only giants, it says when they bore giants and monsters. And that's this similar thing where like sometimes it's giants, sometimes it's something else, something not human at all. And first Enoch, which is apocrypha apocalyptic text as well, and Jubilees These are both writings that were found in the same scrolls and area as the Book of Giants. Both of those writings in chapter 7, in both of them, they also talk about other creatures being born. It actually specifically mentions 3 races, and I have an article on my blog about this. And it mentions the great giants, the Nephilim, and the Eljo, or the Eliud. And we don't know what that last category is. Like, we don't even know where those words come from. It's totally mysterious. But the takeaway is this, that the concept was that it was more than simply just giants. And that's where we get all this wiggle room for the other cryptids and creatures that exist, even specifically in the Bible. In Leviticus 17:7, there's this verse where God tells the Israelites that they can no longer fornicate with and worship satyrs, like goat people satyrs, like fawns, right? He's like, hey, you guys can't do that anymore. And you're like, any modern Christian's like, what are we talking about right now? What do you mean? What fawn? What satyrs? What? You know, what do you mean? Like, you don't make a law that you can't do something with something that doesn't exist, right? And there of course are people who squirm at that and are like, well, no, maybe it meant something else. Maybe it was a goat that was possessed by a demon or something else. It's like, I mean, you can say that. That's not what anybody thought in the ancient context of that. And we can say that definitively because of all these other ancient writings that we have where the Jews are like, yeah, these things exist. Even in, because there's tons of Jewish writing. And in a lot of those legends, they talk about satyrs and they'll describe them in detail. Oh, yeah, there was this time where this Israelite king killed this guy who had, the head of a person but the body of the goat, and just describes a satyr, right? And so then we also have verses like Isaiah 13:21 and 34, verse 14, where, again, this is actually God speaking and is saying, pronouncing judgment over a region or whatever, and he's saying, hey, this area is going to be haunted by, and then we'll list off these mythical creatures, be like, these satyrs. He mentions Lilith in verse 14 of 34.
Oh.
Yeah, he mentions that Lilith will be there, yeah. English translations don't say Lilith. I don't know why. They'll say night monster, they'll say screech owl, they'll say all these different things, but the Hebrew specifically says proper name Lilith, right?
Wow, okay.
Yeah. So God is acknowledging that she's there, but he's treating her as, hey, again, demonic entity that I'm going to have like haunt this area, right? As well as, and of course the Greek version of that is Lamia, right? And then, which the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, is the translation that specifically says Lamia. So it even uses that because they're like, we know who we're talking about, like same one. But it also mentions that this third character, which in the Hebrew really reads more like potentially, it just means like howler, and no one officially, scholars are like, we don't know what this is, right? They're like, I just don't know. I think that the Hebrew really reads more like it would be a dog man, because it's like a howler, it's a dog, they'll say jackal or hyena, and we know it's demonic and chimeric given the other things in the list, that it would be in the same category. But the Greek, the Septuagint of that, right, the Greek version of that, they actually have a completely different word. They put in the word, I'm going to forget how it's pronounced, but it's a word that means like donkey centaur, specifically a donkey centaur. And so you're like, okay, what? Right? And so like, here's some of those weird cryptids that are showing up in the Bible that it's specifically God himself talking. It's not like a person said it and people are like, oh, well, maybe they were wrong. It's like, no, here's Yahweh saying those creatures, 1, you can't have sex with them anymore. 2, you can't worship them anymore. And 3, like they're going to haunt destructive Babylon, right? Really wild stuff. And so if you're looking at that and you're like, well, where do they come from? Biblically speaking, there's no other explanation than these would come from a descendant of the Nephilim, right? Like this would come from that, right? Where you have these lesser gods having sex with people, possibly even animals. We don't know. And then like your story, right? Like, we don't know. And then creating these monsters and creatures that are like, where did that come from, right? Like, what is that? And when we look at the writings, Josephus, who would say this was a Jewish scholar in the Roman Empire, writing about the Jewish scriptures in Greek, so that the Romans and Greeks could kind of understand that you were. So he was hired on to like, hey, can you explain your culture? Can you explain your stuff? Right? He does that, and it's wild. He gives basically a commentary on the whole Bible and history all the way up past Jesus and everything. It's crazy. So what he does is when he's giving that explanation, these two passages I'm citing are from Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus, Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 1, and Book 5, Chapter 2, Section 3. I'll have by the way, I'm like spitting out all this information, all this stuff. I will have I always, like when I go on a podcast, I write everything out. I have links and notes and citations. So I'll put that on my blog and I'll give you the link. So anyone who's listening, I know I'm
great.
speaking fast. I know I have all this information, but you can take your time and go through it. I'll see it for yourself.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so in that he says, hey, he specifically says that these are the giants of Greek mythology, Greek traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And 2, he says that their countenances were entirely unlike mankind. So he literally says that these Nephilim, these giant creatures, monstrous beings, he's like, they don't even look human, which makes me think of Anubis and all those gods with these crazy, right? Everything we're talking about, these cryptid creatures, like, he's like, no, they don't look human. Like, you don't understand. And he even says that they're terrible to the sight and they're terrible to the hearing, like terrifying to hear the sounds that they would even make, right? So
that is like basically every cryptid ever,
right?
That they're you don't want to hear them like late at night in the woods or like anything like that, because that is the end. And if you ever spot them, most of them are just either incredibly hideous. I have definitely covered some on the channel that if I were to see them in real life, I'd be like, not for me.
Yeah, no thank you.
Yeah,
have a nice day.
Or yeah, exactly. Or they kind of resemble humans maybe, but just so incredibly well, ugly or misformed, misshapen that you're like, oh, I don't know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
It resembles a human, but no. I'm like, if you're gonna go that way, I'm just gonna go that way, and we'll leave it at this. Bye.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Wow, they don't even look human.
Some of them did, right? But he was pointing out that like a lot of them didn't.
Wow, yeah, that's kind of where you cross over into the realm of cryptids, into the realm of of monsters.
Yeah,
for example,
like satyrs.
Yeah, no, I mean they are not human. Or even centaurs, even if they have like the upper body of a man, it's still like they're half man, half horse. It's kind of terrifying.
Something not natural about that. Yeah.
No, exactly. And like anything not natural, anything not human. I recently on another show that I'm involved with had Paul Stubbs on, who does the who is known from the clowns are the Nephilim.
I know a guy who knows him. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've had him on my own show, and now I've had him on another show that I'm involved with.
Nice.
He also said, like, with the clowns, like they don't look human. And that's why it's so terrifying. That's why they're so terrifying. They have these, like giant red noses, these giants, like mouths, giant feet, and everything. Tiny umbrellas, also kind of indicating that hey, they are giants. And it's not just Uncanny Valley. Like if there's so many, like pretty much any kid ever is scared of clowns because
they're scary. Just look at it. Yeah.
They don't look humans, and maybe it is this, this very deep-seated fear, like going all the way back to, like biblical times, for example, when these monsters were whatever they were, still more prevalent, and we had to deal with them more often than we do now, thankfully. I can very much imagine that is just like literal blood memory just coming up again and be like, nope, I know that, not doing that.
No, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And that this is, it's interesting because a lot of the writings in scripture that talk about these giants is actually, God talking about them and saying
Hmm.
like, who was mighty enough to destroy them, right? But I, because there are a bunch of times where they're fighting these giants and it's just not enough, right? And God will rain down like brimstone and or hail or whatever and just like destroy full armies of these. I just hit my mic. Full armies of these. I talk with my hands too much, of these giants, right? And that was part of his like display of power. It was like, look, like I can destroy these giants even when you can't, right? Or like there's a story with Joshua, a really cool story where they're fighting these giants and it's too much. And he asked God, "Hey, can you stop the sky? Can you freeze the sun and moon in position so that we have enough light so that we can keep fighting?" And so he freezes the sky for a full day, and they
Oh
continue.
wow.
Yeah, and they continue to fight. And he rains down all this stuff, and they just obliterate this army of giants. And they win. But it's a wild story, and it's really cool. There's been I guess research. I don't know what the right word is with astronomy, but there's a discovery not all too long ago where they found that because we have this software, right? Because they know how the stars are they move very mathematically precisely, right? And
Yeah.
so we're able to map all that stuff. Well, they're able to run things back in time, and it's really cool. And they're able to use that for all sorts of research, right? And that's how we know certain temples were aligned with certain stars at certain times and all that stuff. Well, they rewound and they found a day where they're like, everything in our solar system would have had to stop for a full day, and that makes no sense. And so it was this big thing because they're like, there has to be an error in the program. Like, this can't be right because everything can't just stop for a full day. And we're like, dude,
Yeah.
come on. It was Joshua. It was Joshua and his men. Like, and it was in the right time period too. Of like, that's where that would have happened. So it's a cool
Oh,
story,
that's so
right?
cool.
Yeah. It's neat to see like random things like that pop up and then align, or even that when they're fighting Jericho or whatever. Like, it wasn't all too long ago they discovered Jericho, and instead of the walls falling in, which is what you do when you have a siege, they found the
Yeah.
walls were blown from the inside out. They're like, that doesn't happen. That never,
No,
it's literally
no.
never happened before. They've never found any city like that before. But that's the story, is that they marched around, right? They blew their horns, and it was God who blew the walls out. It doesn't say that they went outwards. It says that he knocked them down. But only that situation would you run into walls coming outward rather than inward. So it's cool.
Yeah.
Those little things that end up backing up, the old
Yeah,
writings
that's
of the world. Yeah.
yeah, no, that's something that's happening more and more that science and the
Mm-hmm.
research that they're doing in all the fields really is now really starting to prove religion right. Even with the pagan gods, even here in Europe, that is happening with the things that they find. There have been quite a few like very hot summers here in Europe. So, a bunch of rivers like dried up or like almost dried up, and
Mm-hmm.
they found artifacts that like indeed confirmed certain stories, but the Anglo-Saxon or the Germanic stories, certain like even glaciers that have molten to a point that we found like it was like a full kit almost, like with arrows and everything, like just perfectly preserved
Oh, I
in
hadn't heard about that.
ice.
That's cool.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. But I'm so happy that science is now finally like, hey, all these things that all these religious people have been saying that happened, yeah, they happened.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's like, I told you, we've
Mm-hmm.
been telling you for hundreds, thousands of years, this is what happens. And, everyone else is like, oh, your ancestors and everyone else, they just had this crazy rich
Yeah.
fantasy or this crazy rich imagination. Even cave paintings depicting otherworldly beings or whatever. And it's like, those silly caveman just drawing random stuff. And then later on, it's like, there might actually be more to this than just, those silly caveman. Whoops.
Yep. Yeah, it's like that with so many things. That's some of the stuff that I've discovered with the dogman research, where Herodotus is like, oh yeah, there are dogmen in Libya, and then you go to Libya, guess what? There's rock art depicting people with the heads of dogs, and you're like,
Yeah.
I wonder why. And people are like, well, there's no archaeological evidence. I'm like, actually, there is archaeological evidence. Like, there are depictions all over the place. Stone
Hmm.
statues and carvings and cave paintings, you name it, But like you said, no, that's just their imagination. It's just metaphor. Not if you ask literally anyone from that period, right? Like, that's why, like Homer, he just made all that stuff up. It's like, well, then, this is why no one was looking for Troy. And then that one guy who was like, I think he wasn't making it up, finds Troy. Maybe it's because they weren't making it all up, right? And, those creatures and things that show up in Homer's writings, like, a lot of those are the ones that we're talking about today. Giants and
Hmm.
cyclops and witches and warlocks. Like, it blows my mind when there are Christians who are like, well, no, there's no such thing as magic. I'm like, have you read the book you say you believe in? Like, there's magic all over in the Bible. Like,
Yeah.
it's always talking about, witches doing all sorts of crazy stuff, and God's like, hey, stop it. It's not supposed to be doing that. But like, one of the craziest ones, talking about cryptids and dragons, right? One of the craziest ones
Hmm.
is in Exodus 7, verse 12, when the Egyptian magicians, they cast their staffs down, they become. So here's the thing. Most like modern translations will just say snake. But the word in the Hebrew is not snake. It's dragon. It's tannin. So literally, and Josephus
Oh.
says this as well. He explained, this is how I stumbled upon this. I was reading writings by Josephus, and he said, oh yeah, and that's when like Moses' staff becomes a dragon. I was like, wait, what are we talking about? So I go back, I'm reading, and I'm like, okay, well, let me see the Hebrew, because I know enough about the Hebrew to see if that's what it's talking about. And I pull it up, and sure enough, it's the word tannin. I instantly am like, no way. So you're telling me that this is what happened. Moses comes in, he's like, hey, Pharaoh, let my people go, right? Kind of famous story.
Hmm.
Pharaoh's like, I don't think so. And it was Aaron's staff. It wasn't Moses' staff. That's a common misconception, because
Okay.
Moses' staff does other things. And Aaron comes in, he casts his staff down, turns into a dragon, right? They cast their staffs down. We don't know how many. Who knows how many dragons, right? They cast their staffs
Sure.
down. Same thing. Boom. Up come all these dragons. So how big? Where were they? Were they outside? I have no idea. But tannin, the idea of tannin, they are not small, right? Like when tannin
Hmm.
is used, sometimes people are like, well, maybe it means whale, because it can't mean something small, right? And obviously this isn't whale, but when they're talking about sea creatures, right? For people who
Sure.
don't like the fact that he's talking about sea serpents, but that's like Genesis 1, 20, verse 21, first page of your Bible, and it talks about God making sea serpents. So just a side fact. But so here's this crazy battle where people are throwing down their magician staffs. They're turning into literal dragons. They're going at war. And then it says that Yahweh's dragon devours every single other dragon to show dominance. It's like, now are you going to let my people go? Like, did you see what I just did? Like,
Wow.
isn't that a crazy story? Yeah, it's insane. And so you look at it, you're like, dude, and Pharaoh's still like, no, not yet. And then it's like thing after thing after thing after of God just like, and this is what he said in that story, right? Literally, God says, I will judge not just Pharaoh, but he says, I will judge the gods of Egypt. It's like he was
Yeah.
judging them. Again, similar thing with that narrative of them rebelling, right? And so
Sure.
what he does with each of those 10 plagues is he was doing something that addressed the powers of each of those 10 gods, right? And so he's like, you know how they have the power of this? Boom, take that. You know how they have the power of that? Boom, take that. And so with each one, it was a display of like, and you see the magicians are keeping up, and then they reach to a point where they can't. And then all of a sudden, God starts doing stuff that they can't pull off anymore. And then ending with the final one, which is really devastating, where he says, okay, fight, like last call, let my people go. And he's like, no, I will not let you do that. And then he sends in the angel of death. Angel of death just comes in, boom, 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 takes out a firstborn of every single family, unless they listened to his warning and put the blood of a lamb over their doorpost,
Yeah.
right? And then that's Passover, right? That's what the Passover is, and that's why people refer to
Oh,
Jesus as, because that's the passing over. He said, "My spirit will pass over; it'll pass you and not kill."
yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah.
So that's that
It
story.
literally passed them over. Yeah.
Literally passing over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So that's the story of Passover. It's a crazy story, right? And then after that, finally, he's like, "Okay, go ahead, you guys can leave. This is too much. And because at this point, the Egyptians are like, please let them go. Like, just stop being stubborn and let them leave so we don't have to deal with all of this crap, you know? And so they finally leave.
It's like destroying armies, fine,
yes.
but he's coming for our kids, for crying out loud.
Yeah, no, but seriously, right? I mean, I would too. Like, I'd be like, please let these people go.
Yeah.
And then of course he has a change of heart and he's like, no, we're going to kill them. And they go after. And what's really interesting is there are a couple different verses in the Bible that actually refer to Egypt in general. This is metaphorical, but still, as they connect it with Rahab, which is the name of a chaos dragon in the Bible. And so in that narrative, when the songs of the book of Psalms, look back on that victory where the Egyptians followed them into the sea that was split in half, and then God lets the waters crash back down, destroys all the Egyptian army. When the songs were written later that were talking about that, they describe it metaphorically as God crushing the heads of the sea serpent, which was Rahab, because Rahab was a common metaphor for Egypt, which is really interesting because they had this way to refer to Egypt as the serpent, or the specific, not the serpent, but like Rahab specifically, like this chaos dragon.
Sure. Yeah.
They're like, oh, look, you're like Rahab. You're big, you're strong, you're mighty. That's like almost cosmic, entity dragon, right? And this was this display of him like crushing the heads of Rahab by destroying the armies of Egypt. So just a fun little fact there, connection to dragons and sea serpents. Yeah. Yeah. It's a crazy story. It's really cool. And that's the thing, is like the Bible, when you give it time to just read it, it's so deep. There's so much meaning. It's so beautiful. Like it's a jaw-dropping narrative, and I believe it's all true. But yeah.
Yeah. Wow. No, those are some amazing stories, and that is magic. Like that literally sounds
Come
like
on. That's magic.
Like a magical battle, like an actual one, like people throwing their staves down, turning into dragons, and like all the other stuff. My wife and I, semi recently, we went to an online lecture, a Zoom lecture of a world renowned Egyptologist, and she also said that back in those days in Egypt, magic wasn't special. It was an everyday thing. Yeah, it was an everyday thing, and that's also you see that everywhere. Like magic, it's normal. Like even offerings, you could say, is performing magic in a way, because you are communing with the gods, and that's also why why every Christian says like, oh, magic is bad. It's like, you sure? No, like rising from the dead is not magical. Making the blind see again is not magical. Turning water into wine is not magic. Literally splitting the sea is not magic. Well, if that is not magic, no. Those are the miracles of God. Okay, I give up.
Yeah, I think the accurate way to say it is that a biblically accurate stance on that would be that it isn't that that magical thing is happening in the moment itself is the problem. It's God's stance is, you do it through me, you don't do it through anyone else. And one of the really interesting differences there is, there's a simplicity of it, which is, I'm the one who's going to be doing these things. You don't go to these other gods. That's the simple version of it. The more nuanced version of it is, because when you read through it, again, like I had an article I put out not long ago that talked about, divination in the Bible, and how, divination was the primary means of God's people communicating with God for a long time, right?
Yeah.
The difference was this, because they're like, but what about Leviticus? It says don't perform divinations. Yes, correct. His point was, I am the one that does these things. Like, you don't go to these other gods to do these things through their power. So you come to me. And the huge difference between like magic, let's say, through God and his miracles versus magic through, the pagan gods, is that pagan gods, you tend to have, there's a system, right? It's like, you do this thing, you'll get this effect, right? You do this thing, you'll get this effect, right? And you show up, you're making this request, they fulfill it, kind of a thing. With God, he goes out of his way to not systematize, where there are a couple of exceptions. One of those exceptions being specifically divination, of like, if you do this, like I'll reveal my will to you. Everything else,
Hmm.
he always shakes it up. You know, one time, hey Moses, you know, hit the rock. The other time, speak to the rock. Different things, right? Yeah, and then he's like, okay, even with Jesus, where he's like, hey, you know, put mud on your eyes, or no, actually, you know, if you just have faith, then it'll heal it, or no, actually, I need you to go wash in this pool. He keeps changing it up, and part of it is that he's like, I don't want you to just have this, um, perform a formula and you'll get X result. I want it to be a relationship with me. If you have a relationship with me, you just ask me, then I'll tell you what to do, and you'll do something different, unique, and oftentimes strange, and you won't even know why. And then it will be, you know, there'll be no doubt that that was obviously me doing that for you. So
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
interesting distinction, right? Where God's like, I'm not going to be predictable in that manner. Whereas, you know, the pagan gods are a lot more like, here's here's your rule book, you know, do this, and more or less you're going to get the same, you know,
Uh,
result.
I mean, yeah, with some, that's more.
It's with
I'd say
magic
that's more.
specifically, right? Like that's not with like
It's more. Yeah,
supplications or
that's no, that's more New Age witchcraft. Though that is not
well,
necessarily pagan magic. Not in a way that that I am familiar, at least. Like,
okay.
yeah, we ask the gods for advice. We can ask the gods for help, and they will. I don't want to say show us how to do it, but like they'll guide us
Mm-hmm.
on the path, or to the path um that leads towards our goal. So
Yeah.
they're steering us in a way. It's like, oh, you want this? Okay, we'll make it happen. But we won't just give it to you. Like, yeah,
Yeah, you
you
have to
have
do
to do
something for it. Yeah.
something. Yeah, exactly. But we will make sure that if you do all the right things, we will make sure it happens. But it's up to you. Like, you don't really expect from us that's like, sure, here, oh, you want that? Here it is. No, it's like, you want that? Okay, cool. We'll help you. Go get it. Go get it. We have your back. We'll give you a nudge in the right direction every now and then, but you really do it yourself. But that's also um that's very European. It's very
Well,
very
that's
Northern
the
European, of course, because it's
supplication part,
harsh.
right? That's the
It's harsh.
yeah, that's the asking. As opposed to like the way that most of that the magic part of it works is that there's more like we know this from incantation bowls and jars, right? Where we have
Mm.
throughout history very specific recipes that they would follow, right? And this is like you do this, you do this, you do that, you'll get this effect. And that applies to way more than just that's very different than asking a god to do something. That's you perform this and you'll get this
Yeah,
result through spiritual means. Like that healing is going to
that's kind
happen,
of
but that's not, you know, by your power. That's by the power of Lilith or Zeus or whatever. There are tons of incantation
yeah,
bowls for
yeah.
Lilith, right?
I bet. I bet. And it's also kind of going into the realm of alchemy, which
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah, magic and alchemy is pretty deeply related, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I've had at least two different alchemists on the show, and each with their own practice, of course, but yeah, very very closely related to magic. But I also believe that indeed the way that the gods are honored, or the way that magic is performed, is really over time has gone to fit to the lands. Like I said, in
Sure.
here in Northern Europe, in general, I mean, it's incredibly sunny outside now, and we're incredibly lucky with that. But that really, it can change any moment, and most of the year it's gray, it's cloudy, it's raining, it's so especially for for our ancestors who had to do everything themselves, grow their crops and raise their animals and whatever, like really no modern, what we think is modern technology. It makes sense that their magical practice would be different than someone from the Levant, or from the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mediterranean. That's why um No, that's why the gods of the Greeks and the Romans are why they're a lot chiller. It seems a lot more focused on living the good life because in the Mediterranean, it is sunny. You have all these very nutritious fruits and
Hmm.
vegetables and whatever, you know, fresh fish. The Mediterranean diet is one of the most healthy diets there
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
So you don't have to really struggle a lot. So you can spend all that time, you know, thinking about thinking and practicing your magic. You know, same in the Levant, you know, but here in Northern Europe, in the colder regions, it's really like, you know, we have to make sure that we get through this winter.
Yeah.
Because if we, you
Survival.
know, exactly, so that really, you know, ingrained itself in our practice, in the way that we honor the gods, in a way that, you know, we practice our magic. Because, you know, nothing is for sure. Nothing is, you know, for granted. We have to work for everything that we have, for
Hmm.
everything that we want. So of course that would, you know, translate into, like I said, how we honor the gods, how we practice our magic, because that is our essence. It is our way of life.
Yeah. It makes me think of, especially when you said like think and then spend time thinking about thinking, of Socrates, right? A lot of people don't know that Socrates was a sorcerer. He said that openly. He said that he saw that as like, he was like, you know, well, how can I be a man of science and not practice magic? Like that was the way he was like, obvious, because someone asked like, oh, do you? This was, I think this was the writing, memorabilia by Xenophon, if I remember this correctly. But it was either that or it
Right.
was one of Plato's works. But you know, Socrates is talking to this person, and they're like, "Oh, do you ever do any magic?" He's like, Psh, "Of course I do. I'm a man of science." And he's like, "You know, how can I be an honest scientist? How can I be a pious, you know, religious person in the higher echelons of society if I'm not involved in magic and sacrifice, right?" And so he goes on to talk about how he was fixing elections. And like he's like, yeah, like that's why like that guy hired me and I made him an amulet. And that's why all the people love him, because he's wearing that amulet. He's like, oh yeah, and then I made this thing. And he just starts talking about all this magical stuff that he made. And he's like, yeah, and people are like, Socrates was just a smart guy, you know? And like, dude, he was literally a sorcerer. And he said he was. Like,
Yeah.
why are we rewriting history? You know, like, yes, he was
Yeah.
he was smart, but like he was a self-proclaimed sorcerer.
That's great. That's absolutely great. I love how science and magic, or science and religion, they were one and the same
Hmm.
back then. It was normal. It was a normal everyday part of life. I never knew that about Socrates, by the way.
Really? Yeah,
That's awesome. It's like,
there you go.
yeah, of course I am. Why wouldn't I be?
Right.
Come on, really?
Because it was so normal.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I'm actually very happy that it is kind of becoming normal again. Like,
Mm.
we are seeing obvious magic happen
It's definitely been
in the
growing.
world. Yeah, absolutely. In every direction, really, you know, right
Hmm.
hand path, left hand path, you name it. It has been growing. The interest has been growing. Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna have to call it here. I still have another show. Luckily, it's just a guest spot, so I can be a little late,
We can
I
wrap it up.
think. Yeah, let's do that. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been very enlightening. This is really, I had no idea it was so prevalent and so normal, really, and that like all the cryptids that we know, really, you know, like satyrs. I mean, come on, everybody knows satyrs. If you've seen
Hmm.
Disney's Hercules, for example,
Yeah.
you know, Philoctetus,
Yep. Yep.
it's that's great. See, this is why I love having people on, also of the opposing religion, if you will.
Hmm.
Like, I'm here to learn as well. So you have definitely taught me a lot. I will definitely look at this these sources for myself. I would love to read and interpret them for myself as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, just again, where can the good people find your work if they want to know, if they want?
Yeah. Yeah, you can just Google Project Eleazar and normally come up pretty quick. But projecteleazar.com is the website specifically. I've got links to all my social media, podcasts I've been on, and all the other articles and good stuff there. So that's the easiest way to find me. But Project Eleazar is my handle on social media too. So you can find me wherever you want to.
Awesome. I'll make sure that the more important links, of course, are in the description box down below. Again, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you very much for enlightening me and enlightening my audience. And to my audience, of course, thank you all for watching. Thank you all for listening. I hope you learned as much from this as I do. If you have any questions, if you have any remarks about a certain cryptid or a certain god, or anything that we have spoken about in the last hour and 45 minutes almost. I could go on for much longer. I have other things to do still. But leave them in the comments down below. I will either forward them or try to answer them myself. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to the podcast and all the bigger podcasting platforms. If you feel like supporting the Greyhorn Pagans, the Greyhorn Pagans podcast some more, please do go to our Patreon at patreon.com/Greyhorn Pagans, where you can subscribe to a tier to your liking. I have at least 3 tiers, different benefits. Of course, the Greyhorn Pagans Book Club. Find us on Instagram at Greyhorn Pagans, and for everything else that we do with the Tribe of the Greyhorn Pagans or the Greyhorn Pagans podcast, go to our website, www.greyhornpagans.com. Thank you all so much. Again, also, thank you all so much for 1K. Yeah, I will see you all soon. I will see you all next time. Bye-bye, everyone. This was yet another amazing episode of the Greyhorn Pagans podcast. We thank you all for watching. We thank you all for listening. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you will be notified whenever we upload something new. Support us on Patreon for early access and for everything else that we do with the tribe, for everything else that we do with the podcast. Find us on www.greyhornpagans.com. For now, we thank you, and until next time.